They called it an auction, but it was a slaughter of the soul. A 17-year-old girl, her future measured in pennies, stood on a block of splintered wood, and just as the gavel was about to fall, sealing her fate, a silent farmer raised his hand, and the world held its breath. Before we delve into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The air in the town hall was thick with the scent of dust, stale sweat, and greed. It clung to the back of Ilara's throat, a physical manifestation of her despair. Below her, a sea of faces swam in the hazy light filtering through the grimy windows, leering men with coin-heavy pouches, and women whose sharp glances were as cutting as any blade. They were neighbors, people who had once nodded to her in the street, who had bought bread from her mother. Now they were vultures circling a carcass. The auctioneer, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, droned on about her youth and untouched purity. Each word was a brand, searing into her skin, stripping away the last vestiges of who she was, reducing her to an object, a commodity. She felt a bitter resentment curdle in her stomach, a feeling so potent it almost choked her. It wasn't just for them, but for her father, whose gambling and weakness had paved this path of splintered wood for her to stand upon. His memory was not a comfort but an anchor, dragging her down into this public shame. She hardened her gaze, focusing on a crack in the floorboards, pouring all her remaining strength into not flinching, not crying, not giving them the satisfaction of her tears. The bidding was pathetic, a slow, humiliating crawl of pennies and shillings, a butcher with bloodstains on his apron, a landowner with a paunch and hungry eyes. The price stalled. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "A pittance for a lifetime," he boomed, his voice dripping with false disappointment. Going once, going twice. The sound of the wood striking wood was about to be the period at the end of her life's first and only sentence. But then a motion in the back of the room. A single calloused hand raised not with a flourish, but with a quiet, unyielding certainty. The room fell silent. The collective gaze of the crowd shifted, a wave of murmurs rippling through the hall, as they turned to see who had cast the final unexpected bid. It was Silas, the farmer from the outskirts, a man who existed more as a local legend than a person. He was a fixture of the town, seen only during market days where he would sell his meager crops without a word, his face a mask of stoic indifference carved from years of sun and silence. No one knew his story, and so they had invented 100 of them. That he was a disgraced nobleman, a fugitive, a man whose heart had been broken so thoroughly it had robbed him of speech. His presence at an event like this was an anomaly, and his bid, an earthquake. The auctioneer squinted, momentarily thrown. The farmer bids 5 gold sovereigns. A gasp went through the crowd. It wasn't a fortune, but it was substantially more than the pile of copper and silver she had been worth moments before. It was a serious bid, a statement. The other bidders, the butcher and the landowner, looked at Silas, then at each other. They saw his threadbare coat, his weathered hands, but they also saw something in his eyes, a flat, unreadable determination that brooked no argument. They were bullies and opportunists, not men of conviction. They scoffed, shook their heads, and quietly lowered their hands. There would be other girls, other debts to collect. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, striking the block with a resounding crack, to the silent farmer on the edge of town. The finality of the word was a different kind of terror. Ilara watched as Silas walked forward, his boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his silence a shield around him. He didn't look at her. He approached the auctioneer's table and laid out 5 heavy gold coins, their dull gleam a stark contrast to the grimy wood. They were old, worn smooth with time. He didn't just buy her, he paid for her with a piece of his history. Then, for the first time, his eyes met hers. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and held no warmth, no malice, only an unnerving, bottomless depth. He gave a short, sharp nod toward the door. Her life had been sold. The transaction was complete. The journey to his farm was a long, suffocating exercise in silence. Ilara sat on the hard plank of the cart, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the rutted road the only sound between them. Silas sat beside her, his hands holding the reins with a practiced ease. his gaze fixed on the horizon. The landscape grew increasingly sparse as they left the town behind, the lush greens giving way to fields of stubborn thistle and sun-baked earth. The world outside the cart seemed to mirror the man next to her, barren, quiet, and guarded. She watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to decipher the rigid set of his jaw, the straight line of his back. Every fiber of her being screamed with questions he refused to answer. What did he want? Why had he paid so much for a girl he wouldn't even look at? The fear she'd felt on the auction block was sharp and immediate, but this was a different kind, a slow-burning dread that settled deep in her bones, the fear of the unknown. As the cart jolted over a particularly deep rut, the motion triggered a memory, sharp and unwelcome. She was back in her family's small cottage, the air thick with the smell of spilled ale and her father's desperation. He was a good man once, storyteller, a man with a laugh that could fill a room. But a few bad harvests, a few foolish wagers, and the laughter had died, replaced by a hollow-eyed anxiety. She remembered the creditors at the door, their voices low and menacing. She remembered her father's apologies whispered into her hair, apologies that felt more like curses. A part of her, a dark and resentful part she refused to acknowledge, hated him for it, hated his weakness, his inability to protect them, hated that his final act was to leave behind a debt that could only be paid with her future. He had not been a monster, merely a man, flawed and broken. But in her world, a man's flaws became a daughter's chains. The cart slowed, pulling her from the bitter memory. Ahead, a small, solitary farmhouse stood against the pale sky, as isolated and silent as its owner. This was her new reality. The farmhouse was as stark and unadorned as the man who owned it. It was small, built of dark weathered wood that seemed to have absorbed the silence of the surrounding fields. There were no flowers in the yard, no welcoming decorations, only a testament to stark functionality. Yet, as Ilara stepped down from the cart, her feet landing on the packed earth, she couldn't help but notice an underlying sense of order. The tools by the barn door were clean and hung in their proper places. The woodpile was neatly stacked. The fences, though old, were mended and strong. It was a place of discipline, not neglect. Silas led her not to the main house, but to a small, separate structure that might have once been a smokehouse or a pantry. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the simple cot pushed against one wall and a small wooden crate that served as a table. A single, small window, high on the wall, was fitted with iron bars. It was, for all intents and purposes, a cell. And yet, the floor was swept clean. A thick mended blanket was folded neatly on the cot. A clay pitcher of water and a cup sat on the crate. He had prepared this place for her. The thought sent a fresh wave of confusion and fear through her. This wasn't the den of a lecherous monster. It was something else, something she couldn't understand. He stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the fading light, his shadow stretching long into the room. He pointed to the pitcher, then to a small vegetable garden visible through the open door, then back to her, a silent command. You will work. You will earn your keep. Then he pulled the door closed, and she heard the heavy final sound of a bolt sliding into place. She was a prisoner, but as she sank onto the cot, the rough blanket a surprising comfort against her skin, she felt a strange, conflicting emotion. She was locked in, yes, but she was also locked away from the world that had tried to devour her. The bars on the window kept her in, but they also kept everyone else out. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the silent gestures of her captor. There was no cruelty, no violence, only an unnerving, monastic routine. Each morning she would find a bowl of simple porridge and a piece of bread left outside her door. The bolt would be drawn back, and she would be free to move about the farm's immediate vicinity. Her work was in the sprawling vegetable garden. The soil was stubborn and rocky, and the labor was back-breaking, but it was also grounding. Plunging her hands into the cool earth, she felt a connection to something real, something tangible, that the whispers and judgments of the town could not touch. She pulled weeds, watered seedlings, and harvested sun-warmed tomatoes, her muscles aching in a way that felt earned, honest. It was a pain that belonged to her, not one inflicted upon her. Silas worked the larger fields, a distant figure guiding his old plow horse, his movements economical and tireless. He never spoke. He never acknowledged her beyond a curt nod to a task that needed doing. Yet she found herself watching him. She saw the way his calloused, rough hands could be surprisingly gentle as he staked a fragile tomato plant. She noticed how he would always leave the fullest bucket of water for her, taking the half-empty one for himself. These were not the actions of a brute. They were small, almost invisible gestures of a strange, indecipherable code of conduct. The tension was not in what he did, but in what he didn't do. He never approached her after dusk. He never entered her small room. He never made a demand of her beyond the day's labor. This limbo was a unique form of torment. She was his property, bought and paid for, yet he treated her like little more than a stray animal he'd taken in, one he was obligated to feed but refused to touch. The silence stretched, becoming a living entity between them, thick with unspoken questions and possibilities. Each night, as the bolt slid shut, she was left alone with her thoughts. What was he waiting for? What price was she truly expected to pay? A storm broke on the seventh day. It rolled in from the west, a bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the sun and bled the color from the landscape. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a frantic shriek, tearing at the roof of the barn and whipping the dust into blinding swirls. Alara huddled in her small room, the sound of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain against the wood a terrifying symphony. Through her small barred window, she saw Silas fighting to secure a loose shutter on the main house, his body a stark silhouette against the strobing flashes of lightning. The world was chaos, a violent disruption of the suffocating silence she had grown accustomed to. Suddenly, a sound tore through the din of the storm, a splintering crack followed by the panicked bleating of an animal. She pressed her face to the window, peering toward the old barn. A section of the ancient roof had given way under the assault of the wind, collapsing inward. She saw Silas run toward the wreckage, his usual deliberate pace replaced with a desperate urgency. He disappeared into the darkness of the ruined structure. Something inside Alara shifted. It wasn't logic or reason, but a primal, immediate impulse. She rattled her door, but it was bolted fast. Without a second thought, she grabbed the small wooden crate that served as her table and slammed it against the door. Again and again, the splintering wood a reflection of the storm outside. The bolt held, but the old wood around the lock gave way. She burst out into the rain, the cold shock of it taking her breath away. She ran to the barn, finding Silas straining to lift a massive, splintered beam. Pinned beneath it was a small lamb, its leg trapped, its cries thin and terrified. He grunted with the effort, his muscles straining, but the beam wouldn't budge. Without a word, she found her place beside him, wedging her shoulder under the heavy wood. He glanced at her, his eyes wide with surprise in the flash of lightning. They pushed together, a shared, desperate rhythm against the weight. The beam lifted just enough. He kicked a support under it and snatched the lamb free. As he cradled the trembling animal, he looked at her, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He opened his mouth and a single rasping word escaped. Careful. The word hung in the air between them, more powerful than any storm. Careful. It was not a command, but a caution, a flicker of concern in a world that had shown her none. The shared crisis had fractured the wall of silence, and in the days that followed, the quiet that returned was different. It was less of an oppressive weight and more of a shared space. The next evening, when she returned to her room, something was different. Sitting on the rough-spun blanket of her cot was a small object, a bird, carved from a single piece of pale, smooth wood. It was simple, almost crude, but the lines were confident, the tiny wings poised as if for flight. It was an offering, a message in a language he could speak. She picked it up, the wood warm from his hands. She turned it over and over, tracing the knife marks, and then she saw it. On the underside, so small it was almost invisible, were two carved initials. E.A. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Those were not her initials. The bird was not for her. It was a relic, a ghost, a memory he had placed in her hands. That night, sleep offered her no refuge. Her mind, spurred by the carving, churned. His silence, his isolation, his purchase of a girl on the cusp of womanhood. It was not about lust or power. It was about loss. a profound, hollowing loss. The image of the bird became a key, unlocking a door in her mind to a story that wasn't hers. She imagined another girl, another EA, perhaps named Eliza or Anna, a daughter. She saw her in this stark, quiet place, her laughter the only sound to fill the fields. She saw Silas younger, a man whose face was not yet a mask, a man who spoke, who smiled. And then she saw the tragedy. A sickness, an accident, or perhaps something darker, something tied to the cruelty of the world outside this farm. The same cruelty that had put Alara herself on the auction block. He hadn't been able to save his daughter, so he had bought a ghost. He wasn't her captor. He was a penitent and she was his penance. He was trying to protect a memory by imprisoning a person, a desperate, broken attempt to right a wrong that could never be undone. The revelation settled over her not with a crash, but with a quiet, heavy certainty. The carved bird felt like a lead weight in her pocket as she worked the next day, a constant reminder of the ghost who lived on this farm alongside them. His silence was no longer a mystery to be feared, but a language of grief she was beginning to understand. She saw him now not as a master or a monster, but as a man hollowed out by sorrow. The anger she had harbored, the fear, it all began to dissolve, replaced by a strange and aching empathy. He was just as much a prisoner on this farm as she was. That evening, she did not wait for him to bolt her door. She waited for him by the main house, standing on the porch as he approached, his form dark against the deep orange of the sunset. He stopped several feet away, his customary caution evident in his posture. He expected her to go to her room. He did not expect her to speak. She held out the small carved bird in the palm of her hand. Who was she? Her voice was quiet, not an accusation, but a simple, direct question. It was the most profound thing she had ever said to him. He stared at the bird, then at her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the chirping of crickets. A battle was being fought behind his gray winter sky eyes. He could retreat back into his fortress of silence, or he could surrender. The lines around his mouth tightened. "My daughter," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, unused to forming words of such weight. "Eleanor." The name was an exhalation of pain. She was, like you, full of fire. He looked away, toward the fields where the shadows were growing long. "The blight took the crops. We had nothing. A man from town, a landowner. He offered to forgive the debt." The subtext hung heavy and unspoken in the air. The same offer, the same price. "I refused," Silas whispered, the words raw. "I thought I could protect her, but she fell ill. A fever. I had no money for a doctor. No one would help. She died in my arms." He looked back at Alara, and for the first time, she saw the unspeakable grief that he had kept locked away. "When I saw you, on that block, I saw her and I couldn't let it happen again." The confession laid the farm's ghosts to rest. In their place, a fragile, tentative understanding began to grow. The dynamic between them shifted, subtly but irrevocably. She was no longer a purchased object, a stand-in for a painful memory. He was no longer her silent, enigmatic jailer. They were two survivors, each bearing their own scars, sharing a small, isolated patch of earth. The bolt on her door was never used again. She began to take her meals with him, sitting at the rough-hewn table in the main house. The silence remained, but it had transformed. It was no longer an oppressive, anxious void, but a comfortable quiet, the kind shared by people who have no need for words to understand one another. He started to teach her, not with commands, but with demonstrations. He showed her how to read the sky for rain, how to mend a fence post so it would hold against the wind, how to tell which seeds were strong and which were weak. He was not teaching a servant. He was passing on knowledge. He was giving her tools, not just for survival on his farm, but for survival in the world. In turn, she brought a quiet life back to the Stark farmhouse. She found a patch of stubborn wildflowers by the creek and transplanted them to a small bed by the front door. The small burst of color was a shock against the muted landscape, a symbol of a stubborn, resilient life. She learned to bake bread in the old stone oven, and the warm, yeasty smell filled the house, a scent of home it had not known for years. One afternoon, as they were repairing the barn roof, he handed her a hammer. "You have a good eye," he said, his voice still rough but steady. Straightened the last nail better than I could have. It was a simple compliment, but for Ilara, it felt like a coronation. He was seeing her, not the ghost of his daughter, not the girl from the auction block, but Ilara. He was acknowledging her skill, her presence, her worth. A new arrangement was being forged, not of ownership, but of a strange, unspoken partnership. Months bled into a year. The seasons turned, painting the sparse landscape in the muted colors of autumn, the stark white of winter, and then the tentative, hopeful green of spring. The farm, under their combined efforts, began to change. The vegetable garden expanded, its neat rows a testament to their shared labor. They acquired another lamb, then a few chickens, their clucking a cheerful domestic sound that pushed back against the encroaching silence of the fields. The farm was slowly breathing again. Ilara changed too. The fear and resentment that had been her constant companions had been weathered away by hard work and quiet dignity. Her frame filled out. Her arms grew strong from hauling water and tilling earth. A confidence settled in her gaze. She learned to stand tall, to meet the world head-on, not with defiance, but with a calm self-possession. The story in the nearby town shifted. When Silas and Ilara went to market, the whispers were different. The leering glances were replaced by looks of confusion, and then, slowly, a grudging respect. They saw not a captor and his prize, but a man and a young woman working side by side, a functioning, self-sufficient unit. They had become an enigma of a different sort, one that defied the town's simple, cruel narratives. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden fingers of light across the porch, Silas came out and stood beside her. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a small, heavy leather pouch. The coins inside made a soft, promising clink. "It's your share," he said, his voice steady. "From the crops. It's enough. To go wherever you want. To start again." He was not casting her out. He was opening the gate. He was offering her the one thing that had been stolen from her, the one thing he had paid to secure, but could never truly give until now. A choice. Ilara looked from the pouch to his face, then out at the field stretching before her. The land was no longer a prison, but a place where she had been rebuilt. The future was no longer a terrifying void, but an open road.